Welcome to the Story 516 podcast, where we sit down with Christians from across denominations and talk about how God is at work in the world today and inspire you to see God at work in your own life in new ways. Welcome back to the Story 516 podcast. I'm Zach, and we have a returning guest today. And returning? I don't know. Is that how you say it when back to back?
Back to back. Yeah. It's 3 times in a row. It'll be a three-peat, but we're not there
Yeah.
yet.
Yeah. We'll see if we can get Jared back. So spoilers, Jared Purdin guest again. This is kind of wrapping up a small arc. I probably use the word arc because I'm a writer and I like character arcs, story arcs, series arcs. So this is Story 516's mini arc where I've brought three topics, all kind of interconnected. The first topic was talking about the meaning behind the name Story 516, where it's based on everyone has a story, and Matthew 5:16 is about uh, let your light shine before men that they might see your good work and glorify God who's in heaven. So the idea behind the name is everybody has a story, but all our stories are supposed to be reflecting the one grand narrative of God and what he's writing. The last episode, we talked about finding those voices that speak to you or speak your language and having the resilience to keep searching until you find those speakers, preachers, teachers who are able to take those core truths, core tenets of Christianity, and explain them in a way that you connect with. So, in this third episode of this arc, I wanted to kind of share a little more, a deep dive, if you will, about one element of finding voices that speak my language that I've found really helpful, and that's through fiction. And the speakers who are able to take fictional narratives, take literature, take movies, TV, plays, books, what have you, and find really creative, sometimes really obvious, but sometimes really just interesting ways of seeing the truths of Scripture, the truths of Jesus, and explaining those truths through using illusions from fiction. So uh, I'm really excited to actually have Jared here because we've known each other for a very long time now.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the things that we've continuously bonded over is storytelling, both movies, books, other forms of storytelling. Probably not as many plays, though. I think we're both fans of like things like Hamilton
Yeah,
and
there's a few.
Les
Yeah.
Mis and things like that. So I'm really excited to kind of dive into this topic with you about finding God in fiction. So when I like just 1,000-foot view, when I just say finding God in fiction, what are some of the initial thoughts that spring to mind?
Yeah. Well, it's interesting because I will say I've recently been, and Zach's been involved in this, but I've recently been doing a study in the book of Genesis and doing that with a few different people. And we've been going through this book with kind of a discerning eye. And I've read through Genesis quite a bit. And I'll get to some other non biblical stories here in a bit too. But it's interesting reading through just the whole totality of Genesis because there was a person in our group who kind of said they have a hard time understanding, a hard time relating to it. And I told that person, and I'm not sure how much it's helped them because I kind of approached it this time, but I told that person to kind of read Genesis, read it more like a novel. Like go through it and try to actually understand it more like a novel, like you would something akin to the Grapes of Wrath or something like that, because Genesis is so story rich that yes, it is a literal story. It is a story of the world's creation, but it is also a story about brothers continuing to feud, starting all the way back at Cain and Abel, and eventually ending with Joseph. And it's a story that somebody pointed out to me that I'd never read Genesis this way, even though I've read it 10 times. But it's a story of God trying to basically understand man, and God basically trying to think of the best way to say this, but God reaching his hand down more and more and more to basically get to a point where he can have a relationship with man. And it's an interesting read when you read it that way because you see God not as just this abstract figure who just sits in the clouds and kind of just judges and smites people occasionally, but as a real person. You see God as a real person who is truly struggling with what has happened to his creation, but it's also trying to reconcile with his creation as well and trying to understand them more. And that was a great way for me to understand that reading of the Genesis story. One example, quick, would be in the beginning, God has the flood. And we all know the Noah's Ark story. And so God eventually has the rainbow, which is the promise that he'll never restart again. And it's interesting because later, when you get to the story of Joseph, there's a move that's done in this book called the chiasm, where you have a similar event that happened at the beginning that mirrors something that happens at the end with the famine that's going to occur in Egypt. But one of the fantastic things that you see is that God sends Joseph and puts Joseph specifically in that place to save all the people from that famine. And it would have been an event similar to the flood that would have wiped out almost everybody, according to what the Bible says. But you see now God is basically saying, we've done the flood, we're past that. I'm having Joseph to save everybody. That to me is a really interesting way to read this story. Now going into fiction quickly, I will say something that also I thought was interesting about the Genesis story in relation to fiction. If you look at the character of Superman, Superman is a character who I think when he is best exemplified, he is by most traits, he is by most traits at least invincible, and not in every way, obviously, like the God that we worship, but he is very much so near invulnerable, minus the whole kryptonite thing that comes in later, and he is a godlike being, small g, in a world of mortals. But many Superman stories are about that being learning to understand humans, learning to work with humans, and learning to, in many ways, be like them and have relationships with them. And it was interesting kind of seeing, like I said, looking at the Genesis story in the way that I did and understanding how one of the themes within it, and then understanding kind of like the character of Superman and how in a lot of the best Superman stories, it's a lot about that Superman trying to understand and work with human beings. So that's one example of fiction. But that's my long-winded explanation. What are some examples that you think of, Zach?
Well, to kind of go off of what you were saying about the Genesis study that we've been a part of, I like the pattern that you recognized of God continuously like reaching his hand down more and more and more. And I was like, wow, you could continue this to the New Testament because Jesus coming in the flesh is like as much as you can reach your hand down and then dying for us. That even made me think of Star Trek a little bit.
Yep.
So I'm going to step on some Star Trek fans' toes. I do want to qualify this as I am a huge The Next Generation fan. I love that show. I hate most of the movies. But one of the things I think, at least the idea behind some of the movies did really well, was expanding on the character of Data. So Data is this android who is always trying to study and learn to be human. They play with different things through the show's run and the movies of getting like an emotion chip or like, can he feel? There's an episode where there's a whole trial of, is Data just a piece of equipment as an android, or does he have rights? What is intelligence? What is life? But I can see that where it's like there's this person that's trying to become more and more like us. And in one of the later movies, I mean, this show's been out for the 80 from the 80s and 90s, so spoilers. But in one of the last movies with the Next Generation cast, which I don't like the movie, but I like this idea, Data ends up dying, which I was like, that's really interesting because kind of paralleling Christ to fully be human, Data had to die. Because that's almost like it's the end point of all humans' life on this planet. So I was like, that's a kind of an interesting parallel too. I really like finding these parallels where it's like this story reminds me of this Bible account. C.S. Lewis and his Chronicles of Narnia is definitely like the easiest entry point to, I think, thinking about fiction like that because he wrote it as an allegory. So I really have appreciated, I think I've grown even to appreciate, uh, especially Lewis's allegory more and more as I've gotten older. because he just had a way of including very deep and arguably complex theological truths and ideas in such a simple way. There's this one moment that I'd been talking with some friends about earlier this fall in the Voyage of the Dawn Treader, where they're on this quest. They enter this dark island, so everything's shadow, and all of a sudden everybody's nightmares start like manifesting in their mind, and everyone's panicked. But then this bird of light, I think an albatross, comes through, and Lucy hears it say, or hears in her mind, take courage, or courage, dear heart. And there was this really amazing line kind of after the fact, that as the ship comes out into the light, and I'll probably slightly misquote it, but it gave the idea of no one was afraid, and there was never any reason to have been afraid in the first place. Or writes it a little more poetically. I don't have my book in front of me, but that was just it was a really neat way of kind of conveying that, a fearless state. And I think you can apply that to many different biblical ideas as well. But yeah, some of my favorite speakers, like Tim Keller, John Eldridge, uh, C.S. Lewis, like, will talk mythology, talk other classic stories. So Jared, what do you think the value is in kind of branching away from the Bible, to be honest and to be fair, to take an illustration from some other material into our when people teach the Bible or talk about the Bible? What do you find, like, what's the benefit of doing that?
Yeah. Well, I think, again, pointing to Lewis, I do remember Lewis talking about how essentially the Christian mythos is a mythos in which is the most, or how should I, is it is the most compelling mythos, and part of the reason it is the most compelling is because it's true. I know that Lewis, as well as many other Christian thinkers and scholars, thoroughly enjoy, whether it be things from Greek mythology, English mythology with King Arthur, but there's many different stories to be enjoyed throughout all of history. Now, the question, I suppose, as a Christian becomes like, why, like you said, why do we think we ought to not just stick only to the Bible, and those are the only stories we should be listening to? And I think it really does come down to what Paul talked about when he talks about how God's law was written on man's heart, but not just the law as well. You also have to understand that all men were created by God with a very similar desire. No matter where you go in the world, people in some way, shape, or form are looking to be understood, are looking for some type of love, are looking for some type of understanding. All different cultures and civilizations have many different ways in which they do things, but you do see human beings being a people who do like to stick with, our groups or our tribes or our families, or even larger scale onto other people in the world. And we do this because I think we are drawn to a lot of things that God has created in us. So when you hear a song, and maybe that song doesn't even have any lyrics to it, it's got a rhythm and a beat to it, all peoples throughout the world can appreciate a rhythm and a beat. Obviously certain types of music are different. Some people use the bongo drums, some people use something else. But the point is that music is something, as an art form, that I feel like is one of the most clear-cut art forms that just is global. It speaks to everyone at some level, shape, or
Yeah.
form,
Yeah.
right? And I also do think that stories, as far as the language barrier can be broken down, does as well. Stories that might include great sacrifice and people laying down their lives for one another. Well, clearly that points to the most archetypal story, that being of Jesus Christ, a God, the God of the universe, literally laying down his life for man, right? When you hear stories about honor and people standing up for what's right and what's good, you might think back to like King David, right?
Right.
Who did have his flaws, but ultimately was, as described, a man after God's own heart, who was a warrior at the time when the warrior culture was very prominent. And so there are many different stories in which I've found myself watching and enjoying and being very attached to, and then later thinking about and saying, yeah, wow, this story clearly points to this aspect of humanity. Maybe it's pointing to, again, our desire to feel love. Maybe it's our pointing to our desire to find truth. Maybe it's, I know in the aspect of truth, one of the greatest miniseries I've watched that I know we watched together was the Chernobyl miniseries. And the whole theme of that whole movie is that if you do not tell the truth, that whole series, I should say, if you do not tell the truth, bad things can happen. And
Right.
if you know that historical event, yeah, nuclear reactor melted down and things went pretty bad for a while. Point being, to wrap it all up, is I think there's plenty of different stories that you can look to that resonate with a lot of people. And whether those people are Christian, Hindu, atheist, that they can still resonate with all people because we're all created by the same God.
One of the quotes that connects to this topic for me, that's also one of my favorite quotes of all time, is from the singer songwriter, author, all around talented individual, Andrew Peterson. He said once, if you want a child to know the truth, tell them the truth. But if you want a child to love the truth, tell them a story. And I really think that gets to the heart of stories are a way that we communicate. We can cut through some of the barriers we put up to learning or to different things, and a story can sneak through that. C.S. Lewis has this great quote. It's really long, so I'm not going to even attempt to touch it, but he talks about it. If you're wanting to look up the full quote, it's about stealing past watchful dragons. So for Lewis, he talks about how he would always have a hard time feeling the way he was told he ought to feel, like in church or about the sufferings of Christ. Because almost this compulsion that you're supposed to feel a certain way would sometimes freeze up feelings in him. But then he wonders and speculates in this quote that what if by casting all these truths about the sufferings of Christ into a fictional world, Aslan, you're able to steal past those watchful dragons that prevent you from feeling the potency of the truth, of the true account of Jesus. And I genuinely believe Lewis accomplished that through the writing of Narnia. But I also think there are other stories, like things like in Return of the Jedi, Luke Skywalker tossing his lightsaber to the side and saying, I will not fight you, refusing to give in to hatred and vengeance, resisting that temptation. Like, I think that can be a really great illustration to talk about the heroic nature of resisting temptation.
Not just that, but sorry, one of the things I thought of too is I see that in what you're saying, but the thing I always caught and it struck me so much about Return of the Jedi is about how the redemption arc that Vader gets. How
Yeah.
basically anybody, and Vader is, essentially supposed to be a stand-in for a space Nazi,
Yeah.
essentially.
Yes.
But how anybody can basically see the errors of their ways and repent and turn, even if they have done great evils, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
So one of the things in alignment with that is I brought up earlier how I had watched a movie or I had, maybe heard a song and it really resonated with me strongly. And I had to kind of ponder about it and think about it for a while, why maybe it did. Can you think of an example that's happened with you where you've maybe watched something or you've seen something and you just weren't sure why you liked it so much, but eventually it clicked?
Yes. And I know you're going to roll your eyes, so we'll see if the audience can hear you rolling your eyes. But a lot of anime that I've watched, actually, there's something about many of like the anime films. So think some of the Studio Ghibli films that capture a sense of longing that would just leave me thinking about them so much. There's um there's this scene in the movie Spirited Away, which I mean, be forewarned if you haven't seen this movie, it is one of the weirdest things you will ever see. It's appropriate, but it's like weird and bizarre because it's full of Japanese, probably mythology and culture, and that's very different from what we grew up in the West. But there's this scene, and to be honest, I've thought about this for a long time. I'm kind of a film nerd, and I think this scene might be my favorite scene from any movie I've ever seen in my life. And it's just a few minutes long, and it's this girl on on a train, There's no dialogue. It's just music and visuals of her traveling somewhere, and you can tell that she's just pondering things, but there's this mix of melancholy, longing that's just really poignant to just sit in. You're just sitting in this emotion for a while. So that's like one moment of like the longing that I've experienced like emotionally from watching a number of different anime films. And after thinking about it, it's really connected with something that Lewis said. I keep going back to C.S. Lewis, but I think I consider C.S. Lewis kind of the master at this. But he talks about, there's another great quote. I should have just come prepped with like my entire C.S. Lewis
Yeah.
collection, and just I could have just read for you C.S. Lewis and then called that a day. But there's this quote where he's talking about heaven and how it's a tune that we have not yet heard, news from a country we haven't visited. And it's just this sense of longing. And I think Tolkien encapsulates that with his talk about a far green country. And Peter Jackson adapted it really beautifully in a scene with Gandalf talking to Pippin about how they're in a dire situation where it looks like they might not make it out alive. And Gandalf, the mentor wizard character, is talking about how the journey doesn't end. Death is just another path. It's one that we all must take. And then he adapts the Tolkien language of the gray rain curtain of this world rolling away. And there you see it, white shores and beyond a far green country under a swift sunrise. And I was just like, that's a beautiful way of encapsulating the idea of heaven, of just that hope, that longing. So for me, anime has been one of those areas that just really taps into that longing. And then as I think about it and engage my mind, I can connect that to the longing we all feel for God and for the world to be restored, and heaven, for Eden. Did you have an example of like a story that's really connected with you in a way like that?
I have one that's kind of a spoiler, but honestly, the movie's been out for like 40 years, so it's fine at this point. But there are a lot of various movie scenes I could think of, but one I remember resonating quite strongly with me is actually the end of the original Blade Runner movie from the 1980s, I believe. And spoilers if you don't want to hear about it, but it's been out for a long time. But it is definitely a more mature movie, and it is a movie in which, long story short, it's a movie in the future where you have androids who are basically human robots, and you have humans. And this one human detective is set to hunt down these androids who have gone rogue. Um, and throughout the movie, what you see humanity. This is a dystopian future where humanity has really lost anything that it considers that we now consider to make it human. Compassion for one another, community. Caring about truth, like we talked about earlier. It's really just very dystopian, and most humans have basically devolved or denigrated into just really caring about various desires and pleasures and just getting by. And this one android, this robot, is trying to survive as his programming has that he's going to pass away and die soon. And at the end, the detective catches this android. He's going to kill him, but then he gets put into a situation where the android sees him hanging off a rooftop and he can kill him. However, in his last moments before this android dies from his programming, he actually saves this detective who is going to kill him, and he simply saves him just to explain to him all these various experiences that he had and how he's going to miss those. And they're all going to fade away like tears in the rain, is the line. And then he passes away and dies. And as he does so, it's very on the nose. A dove flies off, much of in the obviously biblical imagery of the dove being a spirit, right? And the ending stuck with me very strongly because it just seems to show that at the end of the day, a lot of the human experience and a lot of what it means, maybe in connection with your longing too, is we have this desire to keep going. We have this desire that these experiences aren't just temporary. We want to share them with people. We want to continue. We want to continue to live in a way in which we can be fruitful with one another. And it's interesting because I've listened to a lot of people talk about this ending, and whether you're a Christian, this appeals to atheists as well. There's a lot of atheists who I've heard talk about this and talk about how it's beautiful in the sense that this is a very human connection that this android is forming with this human. And the point of all of it is basically just to say that it seems to me to point to a desire of eternal communion with one another in which we are living together, experiencing things. And it seems to point towards our desire towards a heaven, to be in connection with our Creator.
Yeah, and I think that connects beautifully with kind of the name Story 516 and kind of the mission of seeing our stories in light of the grand narrative that we're all a part, that God's inviting us to be a part of. So what do we do? Where do we leave you, the audience, with? I mean, this will be maybe the most fun homework you'll receive. Go watch movies. But don't just watch movies. Don't just read books or watch your favorite show or go to your favorite musical. Think about, what is this piece of entertainment saying? What's the message behind it? What truths are hidden within its pages? Maybe obviously, maybe a little, you might have to do a little digging. How can this connect with the Bible? How can it remind you of the Bible? Because I think that's part of that idea of like praying continuously, or verses like that really kind of indicate this vibrant, ongoing, ever present relationship with God, that a lot of times I think that's just us thinking about it and being like, oh, why do I really like superheroes? Is it because I'm looking for a hero to save me? Guess what? Jesus. Are you feeling lost in life and you feel like you're Nemo from Finding Nemo, but then you see that you have a father who left his comfortable home, left the 99, and traversed an ocean to find you and bring you home? Is it something that's maybe a little more clear or like upfront about its some of its like biblical or like spiritual allusions, like It's a Wonderful Life, and seeing that, hey, people are being continuously positively impacted by your life, and you just need that reminder of, as you follow Jesus, the fruit of the Spirit is going to be impacting others even if you can't see it right now. So that's kind of what I would like to leave you, the audience, with, is to think about the movies you watch, think about the shows, the books, and really spend a little extra time. It can just be a minute, it might be 5 minutes. Maybe you'll do a whole small group study going through Pixar movies or something. I think that would be really cool. And talking about the lessons, the biblical lessons that you can find in those. But, anyways, thanks again, Jared, for joining me today to talk about fiction and finding God within the pages of a good story. Thank you for joining us. You can support the show by going to our Patreon page at patreon.com/story516. You can also find us on Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, Spotify, and Apple Podcasts. We look forward to seeing you next time.